After being ghosted by my entire family for 12 years, they showed up at my $1 million home pretending nothing happened. I welcomed them in, then casually pointed to the guest list they weren't on. "Hey Reddit, I'm Callum, 40M, and this might be the longest post I've ever written here, but I need to get this off my chest. Something happened a few weeks ago that left me not angry, exactly. More like stunned. But not in the kind of way where you're pleasantly surprised. No. The kind where you look around and wonder how people can have the nerve to show up in your life like they never set fire to it in the first place. This is a story about my family. Or rather, the people I used to think were my family. Let me take you back a bit. I was born in a modest but well-kept neighborhood on the edge of a small town. You know the kind. 3 churches, 1 gas station, and everyone knowing where you were last Sunday. My parents, Everett and Astrid, were the kind of couple who prided themselves on being pillars of the community. Astrid in particular liked that phrase. Pillars. As if we were statues being displayed for judgment. From the outside, it probably looked like a picture-perfect life. My dad ran a small accounting firm and did people's taxes out of a home office that smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. My mom was a teacher at the local elementary school, stern, polished, and always 2 steps ahead of you in any conversation. She dressed like she was on her way to court even when she was just going to the grocery store. I was the middle child. My older brother Harris, now 43M, was the golden boy from day one. Not just in the way parents sometimes favor one child, but in the way a monarch chooses a successor. Everything he did was celebrated. He won a spelling bee in 2nd grade, and there was a newspaper clipping framed in our hallway for years. When he got a business degree from a mid-tier college, Astrid introduced him at every family event like he was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Then came me. Quiet. Always drawing or building things out of wood and glue. I was the kid who took apart clocks to see how they worked, who asked why too many times, who didn't fit neatly into any box. My mother used to sigh when she looked at me as if I were a smudge on her otherwise polished window. And then there was my sister, Alora, now 35F. She was soft-spoken but calculating. Growing up, she had this way of watching everything from the sidelines, never fully getting involved until she knew which way things were going to go. She learned quickly that siding with Harris and my parents kept things calm, and Alora liked calm. So she played her role perfectly. Doted on our mother, laughed at Harris's jokes, stayed out of trouble. She wore innocence like armor. Our home was never loud. Not in the way you might expect from a household with 3 kids. It was more like a museum, everything clean, ordered, expected. Feelings were things to be managed, not expressed. My father wasn't cruel, exactly. Just absent in spirit. He'd sit through dinners nodding at Harris's stories, occasionally offering a few dry comments. He rarely looked at me unless it was to ask if I'd found a real plan yet. Things started to change around the time I turned 17. I had fallen in love with architecture, not in the romanticized, TV show kind of way, but in the gritty, obsessive way. I spent hours sketching buildings from magazines, rearranging furniture in the house to my mother's deep annoyance, and applying to mentorship programs instead of traditional colleges. When I told my parents I wanted to apprentice with a local architect instead of going to university, they reacted as though I had announced I was joining the circus. Astrid pursed her lips and said, "So, you'd rather be someone's assistant than go to school like a real adult?" Harris snorted. "You're throwing away your future to sharpen someone's pencils." I remember Alora looking at me from across the table, silent. She didn't say a word. She just blinked, tilted her head, and gave me this expression I still can't forget. Pity? Disapproval? Fear of being associated with the family disappointment? Maybe a bit of all 3. That was the beginning of the end. From then on, it was like I had been erased from the narrative. When family came over, they bragged about Harris's internships, Alora's scholarships. Me? I was just taking some time to figure things out. I tried to bring up my apprenticeship once. Astrid changed the subject before I could finish my sentence. Still, I stuck with it. I worked my way up slowly. Took community college classes in the evenings. Saved every penny. I lived in a cramped apartment with creaky pipes, the kind that never really gets warm in winter, but I was doing what I loved. I was building something. And I still tried, desperately, to share that with them. I called. I sent updates. I invited them to see my first small project, a renovated library entrance in a nearby town. They didn't come. No one even replied. Then came my housewarming party at 28. That was the last straw. I had finally saved enough to buy a little place of my own. Not fancy, but mine. A fixer-upper with good bones. I invited them with handwritten cards. I even asked Alora personally if she thought they might come. She smiled and said she'd check with Mom. That was the last I heard. On the night of the party, I waited an extra hour before starting. I kept glancing at the door, hoping to see a familiar face. Nothing. I ended up sitting alone in the backyard that night after everyone had left, wondering what I had done to deserve being forgotten. 3 weeks later, Harris sent me an email. 3 lines. No greeting. We're moving forward with our lives, Callum. It's time you stop forcing connections that aren't there. Good luck. And just like that, they vanished. No birthday cards. No texts. For 12 years, it was like they had scrubbed me from the family records. And then, just last month, they reappeared. Like ghosts who had been waiting for the perfect moment to rise from the ground. It was at an event I was hosting. Something I had been planning for a year, a fundraiser to help support youth transitioning out of foster care. A cause close to my heart. Everything was carefully arranged. The guest list, the performances, the layout, even a gallery wall showcasing design sketches from the young people we were mentoring. The guest list was strict. No uninvited guests, no walk-ins. It was my home, my space. And yet, halfway through the evening, as I was speaking with one of our donors near the back garden, I noticed a small group entering through the front gate. My assistant looked confused. She turned to ask me something, but I was already walking toward the entryway. 3 people, dressed like they belonged. Astrid, Harris, Elora. They looked around like tourists in a place they used to own. Astrid adjusted a brooch on her blazer and smiled as she took in the house, the landscaping, the polished floors. Harris greeted someone like it was a networking event. Elora had her phone in her hand, already taking photos. They hadn't seen me yet, and I hadn't said a word. But something in me shifted. Not in anger. Not yet. It was quieter than that. Like a gear clicking into place. Because if they thought they could walk back into my life this easily, after everything they'd done, then they clearly didn't know me anymore. So I let them come in. I watched them move through the house I had built, the life I had shaped. I even watched Elora pause at one of the framed sketches on the wall, one of mine from years ago, and smile like it meant something. I turned, walked quietly to the check-in tablet near the front, and pulled up the guest list. Their names weren't on it. They weren't supposed to be here. But now they were. And I had no intention of letting that go unnoticed. There they were, 3 ghosts from a past I had long since buried, walking around my home like it was just another Sunday at Aunt Lorna's. You'd think someone might look a little sheepish showing up uninvited to a home they'd actively chosen to forget existed. But not my family. Astrid's heels clicked sharply across the marble tile in the entryway, each step as deliberate and self-assured as I remembered. She had the same exact haircut she had when I left, a sleek iron bob, not a strand out of place. Her mouth curled slightly as she glanced at the gallery wall of framed architectural prints, most of them created by our youth program students, and a few, just a few, by me. Very modern, she commented aloud to no one in particular, tone flat, like she was commenting on the weather. Harris stood with his hands in his pockets, surveying the room like he was trying to spot someone more important than me. And Elora was the most confusing to look at. She had aged softly, still dressed in muted colors and long sleeves. Her eyes scanned everything with that same clinical detachment I remembered from childhood, as if she were trying to understand how all the pieces fit without having to ask a single question. Still, no one had noticed me standing by the guest list kiosk, tucked just to the side of the entrance arch. I let them drift through the room a little longer. Let them look. Let them pretend they belonged. I didn't interrupt them. Not yet. I wanted to see how long it would take for them to pretend they hadn't just erased me from their lives for over a decade. It took exactly 5 minutes and 14 seconds. That's when Harris spotted me near the entryway and lit up with the most insincere smile I've ever seen. There he is, he called out, walking toward me with an outstretched hand. Man, it's been a long time. I didn't shake it. Instead, I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. Harris. That's all I said. Flat. Neutral. Controlled. He let the hand drop. This place is incredible. Seriously. Never would have pictured it. He looked around again. You've done well for yourself. I gave a small nod. I have. Behind him, Astrid walked up slowly, arms crossed in front of her pristine beige blazer. She looked at me as if we had only been apart for a few months, as though our last interaction hadn't involved her refusing to acknowledge a single milestone in my life. Callum, she said, voice clipped but cordial. You've certainly made a name for yourself. It's bigger than I expected. Bigger than she expected. That's what she chose to say after 12 years of silence. I didn't respond to that. Not directly. I let the silence hang between us, watched it stretch thin until Alora stepped forward. "We saw the announcement in the paper," she said, tucking her phone into her bag. "The fundraiser. And I told Mom and Harris we should come. It's important what you're doing here." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "Is that why you're here?" She hesitated, a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. "Of course. We wanted to support you." I slowly turned the check-in tablet toward them. "You weren't on the list." There it was, that subtle flicker of panic in Alora's eyes. Not fear. Embarrassment. Like being caught entering a dinner party you hadn't been invited to. "Oh," she said. "Well, we thought it might be an oversight. You probably had so many names to keep track of." I leaned in slightly. "It wasn't." Astrid stepped forward, her voice low and cool. "Is this really necessary? Are we going to play games, Callum? After all this time?" I met her gaze directly. "I'm not the one playing." It would have been so easy to explode then, to ask why they were here, to demand an apology, to drag every ignored phone call and every unanswered message into the light. But I didn't, because the truth is, I already knew why they were here. It wasn't the cause. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even nostalgia. They had seen something. A news article, maybe. A feature in a business journal. Some online piece on the success of the youth architecture program I'd founded. My name had popped up in their world again. Not as the embarrassing black sheep who couldn't find a real plan, but as someone with money, influence, and visibility. And suddenly, I was worth noticing again. I could see the calculation behind Astrid's eyes. She was already assessing the crowd, spotting potential donors and community leaders she could charm. Harris was scanning the layout like he owned it. Alora, I still wasn't sure about her. She was harder to read, always had been. "You're welcome to stay," I said at last. "If you'd like. There are name tags by the front table. I glanced at the list again, then back at them. "Don't speak on my behalf." Astrid opened her mouth, closed it, and turned on her heel. She walked away like I'd just embarrassed her. Harris shrugged and followed her, giving me a once-over as he passed, like he was still trying to figure out where this version of me had come from. And Dolores stayed. She stood there for a moment, eyes flitting between the tablet, the hallway, and me. "You've changed," she said, voice low. I nodded. 12 years will do that. You were always the quiet one." I had to be. No one was listening. She winced, just slightly. And then she walked away too. I took a deep breath and watched them blend into the crowd. People mingled, glasses clinked, and soft music played under the buzz of quiet conversations. No one knew. No one had any idea the people in the corner near the sculpture garden had once erased me with the cold efficiency of a file being deleted from a computer. But I knew, and I wasn't done, because this wasn't going to end with an awkward encounter in a hallway. No, there was more I needed them to see, more I needed them to understand. And when the night's speeches began, when I finally stepped up to the microphone in front of the entire room, with their eyes on me and the crowd leaning in to hear every word, I made sure they were seated close enough to see exactly what they had thrown away. When I stepped up to the podium, I made a point not to scan the room for their faces. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking they were the reason I was nervous, or the reason I wasn't. Instead, I focused on the small group in front of me, the students in tailored thrift store blazers and secondhand shoes who had worked with me to design the community housing project we were unveiling tonight. Kids who had been told, like I once was, that their dreams were impractical or unrealistic, that they should be quiet and grateful and out of the way. I waited until the chatter died down. "Good evening, everyone," I began, hands resting lightly on either side of the podium. Some of you know me personally. Some only know the program. Some may just be here for the silent auction. That's all right. All of it counts. There was soft laughter. Light, polite. But I wasn't there to charm. I wanted to start with a story, I said, glancing at the students who sat closest to the stage. "It's a personal one. I promise it'll make sense." I took a breath. When I was 17, I showed my family my first model home. I built it out of cardboard, foam board, hot glue. You name it. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I spent 3 months on it. I was proud. My voice didn't crack. Not even a little. I remember placing it gently on the dining room table, clearing away the dinner plates myself because I didn't want anyone bumping it. I had added little details, miniature stairs, a rooftop garden, even working lights. I looked at the crowd. My family walked past it. There was a ripple through the audience, small, uncomfortable. They asked me to move it so they could set down the dessert tray. Another pause. They told me architecture was a hobby for people with money, that it wasn't a real job for someone like me. And when I brought it up again, a few months later, my brother called it embarrassing. My aunt said, and I quote, "We don't have time to entertain your cardboard dreams." I could hear the shuffling of feet, a few sideways glances. And I knew exactly where they were sitting. That was no accident. The seating chart hadn't been random. But it stuck with me, I said. Not their comments. Not their dismissal. What stuck was how small they made me feel for trying. And I promised myself, if I ever made it out, if I ever found a way to build something that mattered, I'd find others like me. People who were told they weren't enough, that they didn't belong. I gestured toward the row of students. And now I'm surrounded by them. There was quiet applause, and I let it swell a little, just enough to breathe in. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I wanted to share that tonight. I said, quieter now, because this fundraiser isn't just for building homes. It's about dignity. It's about rebuilding belief in people who've had it stripped away by systems, by circumstances, and sometimes by family. I didn't need to look their way. I knew they heard it. I wanted that line to sit on their skin like cold water. And speaking of family, I turned slightly toward the projector screen, now humming quietly behind me. We're also debuting our newest project, created by our student design team. It's called The Row. Lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. I watched the photos roll. High-contrast architectural renderings, aerial views of eco-efficient housing, interior layouts, before and after shots of blighted lots transformed by the very hands sitting in the front row. But the last slide? That one was mine. It was an image of my childhood home. No names. No address. Just a photo I had taken the day I left for college. Before the years of silence. Before the accusations of selfishness and arrogance when I chose not to return for holidays. The photo faded into a blueprint sketch of the row, nearly identical in layout, but reimagined into affordable duplexes with solar panel roofs, community garden lots, and fully accessible ramps. It was my quiet middle finger, inked in grid lines and measurements. Not a dramatic call-out, but a mirror. The audience murmured in appreciation, but I knew better than to get lost in applause. After the presentation wrapped, I took my time, making my way down the side stairwell from the stage. My assistant, Laura, came over to ask if I needed anything. Water, maybe a break, but I shook my head. I wasn't going to hide from this part. Because here they came. Astrid was first, lips pressed into a line so thin it barely registered. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Was that really necessary? She asked, keeping her voice low, but her tone tight. Which part? I replied calmly. You know which part. I glanced toward the projector. The blueprint? It's based on a common layout. I think you're reading into things. You're not being clever, Callum, she snapped. You're being cruel. I tilted my head. Is that what this feels like? Harris had caught up now, hands clenched at his sides. You humiliated us. Interesting, I said softly, because 12 years ago, when I sat alone at graduation and waited for someone who never showed up, I don't remember you calling that humiliation. That's different. No, I said firmly, locking eyes with him. It's not. Elora was there too, hanging back, her face unreadable. But she was listening. I leaned in slightly, my voice quieter now, not for secrecy but precision. You showed up here pretending nothing happened. You ignored my existence for over a decade. You didn't just drift away. You made a choice to cut me off when I became inconvenient. When I stopped playing by your rules. When I chose something you didn't understand. Harris scoffed, but I wasn't done. And now that there's a spotlight, now that the words nonprofit and community impact are being thrown around next to my name, you want in. You want to smile for the cameras, take photos at the exhibit, act like you've always supported me. I stepped back, letting that sink in. This isn't your story. And you don't get to rewrite the beginning just because you're proud of the ending. Astrid opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. I'm not done. I turned to Elora then, not to Harris or Astrid. You said earlier that I've changed. You're right, but not in the way you think. I'm still me. Still stubborn. Still quiet when I should be loud. Still a little too attached to blueprints and foam boards. But the difference is, I don't need your permission anymore. And then I walked away. Not dramatically. Not quickly. Just walked. Past the displays. Past the donation table. I didn't look back as I walked through the crowd. A few people tried to stop me, donors, old professors, some city officials, but I gave polite nods, made soft eye contact, and kept moving. I had rehearsed this final act 100 times in my head. Not because I wanted to be theatrical, but because I wanted it to be final. I wasn't going to let them blur the lines again or spin the story into one where I was the ungrateful one. No. This time, I had the mic, literally and figuratively. The press coordinator, Tilda, waved me down at the photo booth set up just beyond the main exhibition floor. "We're getting a few group shots before the guests move into the dining room," she said, already motioning to the photographer. "Sounds good," I replied, eyes scanning the polished tile behind her. And just as I expected, they were there, Astrid, Harris, and Elora already sidling up to the center, plastering on their best public smiles. Astrid adjusted her scarf. Harris smoothed back his hair. Elora was slightly off to the side, trying to look more like a curious observer than a participant. It was subtle. They had always been good at subtle. I turned to Tilda and said, "Can you pull up the confirmed guest list on the tablet?" She handed it over without hesitation. She knew I ran things tightly. I held it in my hands and let the silence settle. Then I turned around, slowly, and walked toward the photo set. Astrid spotted me first. "Callum," she said, with a performative little sigh of relief. "We didn't know if you were joining us." Tilda said, "You're not on the guest list," I said calmly. Harris blinked. "Excuse me." I held up the tablet and turned it so the screen faced them. I cross-checked every confirmed attendee. I had to, since the venue has strict limits on headcount. "You didn't RSVP. You weren't invited." "You're making a scene," Elora muttered. "No," I said. "I'm making a boundary." There it was. The first real silence of the night from them. Astrid straightened her spine. "You can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "This. Narrative. This grudge. You've made your point. But we're still your family." I actually laughed, short and sharp. "Family is a two-way street, Astrid. I walked mine alone for 12 years. You chose to walk away." "No. I chose not to beg." A few heads were turning now, subtle and curious. I kept my tone low, but I didn't flinch from the attention. "You cut me off the moment I didn't fall into line. When I got that scholarship, you said it was a fluke. When I started the nonprofit, you said it was performative. And when I finally stopped returning your once-a-year texts, you called me dramatic." Harris shifted uncomfortably. "We were just trying to teach you discipline. You taught me fear," I corrected. "You taught me shame. You taught me that love was conditional and approval was earned. I had to unlearn all of that just to be able to breathe on my own." Elora folded her arms. "You think success makes you better than us?" "No," I said, letting the silence stretch. "But it means I don't need you anymore." Then I nodded to Tilda. "Can you escort them out?" She looked surprised for only a second before her expression hardened into something professional and efficient. "Of course." Astrid's mouth opened in shock. "You're kicking us out?" "You invited yourselves," I said. "I'm just making sure you leave the way you came, unannounced." Harris stepped forward like he might say something else, but Tilda moved between us smoothly. "Right this way, please." I watched them go. No part of me wavered. They didn't yell. They didn't cry. They didn't beg for forgiveness or even try to twist it into concern. That was never their style. They walked out with that same smugness they had worn to my graduation, to my childhood birthdays, to every moment where I'd reached out and they hadn't reached back. I turned to the photographer. "We can start the photos now." The pictures we took that night were beautiful. Me with the students, with the board, with volunteers and staff, and the elderly woman whose house we just finished building that month. There was laughter in those photos. Real laughter. No forced smiles. No masks. Later, as the evening wound down and the last guests filtered out, I sat at the edge of the stage and looked out at the space we had built, not just the venue, but the life around it. The people, the mission, the impact. They hadn't made a dent in any of it. In the weeks that followed, Astrid sent me an email. Short. Cold. "We didn't deserve that." I didn't reply. Then Elora messaged me on a private number. "Callum, I think we need to talk." I didn't answer. Because I was done giving them the chance to rewrite the story. Done giving them access to things they never cared about building. They weren't misunderstood. They weren't complicated. They were cruel in the way that's easy to overlook because it's dressed in politeness and tradition. Because it wears family titles like armor. But I had stopped mistaking proximity for love. Now, I have a new family. One I chose. One that doesn't shame me for dreaming or loving what I do or needing space when I need it. And for the first time, I can say this without hesitation, I don't miss them. Not even a little.